Hello everyone, this is Dr. Stringer. We are talking about the history of police this week. So briefly talk about that. I don't have a whole lot to add about that because it's kind of history, so it is what it is, right? I know it's not the most engaging topic, but we need to hear about the history of police so we can kind of analyze where we've been, where we're going, and where we are now, and try to not repeat the same mistakes that we've had in the past. So, with that being said, I'll move right along to looking at this and brief review of this. Obviously, it's all in your textbook as well. So, in the pre-police era, you kind of had some different types of police patrols. You had what was called the constables and the Night's Watch. That was not guarding the wall in Game of Thrones. Little joke there for you. For those of you that watched Game of Thrones, they had the Night's Watch, and Jon Snow was a member, but we did not have Jon Snow then. Anyway, here in Georgia, they had the slave patrols, which were generally aimed at arresting black folks back in the slavery era. So when you look at this, you really kind of see the beginning of kind of racial profiling in the policing all the way back to this period, which is quite concerning, and it kind of makes you realize that we've kind of had this problem for a long time. So it's not that surprising that it persists today, even though it could obviously not do that. Obviously. Anyway, and then the sheriff. Sheriffs usually had, you think about the Wild West and stuff like that in less populated areas. The Night's Watch was generally in your big cities and stuff like that, mainly up north. And then the sheriffs you tend to have more out west, and then you had slave patrols more so in the south, where slavery was a bigger issue. So then you had the political policing era, and this went from like the mid 1800s to 1900s. As the name says, it was very political. There were little and no training of the police officers, and as the politicians moved in and out of office, they had their own police officers. So you'd have a whole new police force if you had elected a new person. Obviously, we don't have that today. Nowadays, you might see the chief get changed out or something like that, but they don't change the entire police force with the coming and going of different politicians. Anyway. And this kind of went along with the creation of cities and stuff like that, and the abolishment of slavery. And so this led to a lot of the creation of what are called black codes or the Jim Crow laws. Those of you interested in that stuff, David Oshinsky wrote a really good book called Worse Than Slavery, which talks about how in the South there were issues with finding people to work on the farms after the abolishment of slavery, because the people that owned the farms had essentially relied on slave labor, and so then they created these kind of Jim Crow laws to essentially arrest black folks and then make them put them on chain gangs and stuff like that to make them work the farms. So it's essentially just a way of re-enslaving people after slavery was abolished, because remember, the South wasn't a big fan of that either. So you see this kind of racial conflict perpetuating even through there, and that is reflected in other works that have come up in recent years too, talking about how we kind of use the criminal justice system to kind of control certain segments of society and things like that. And so, the origin of this stuff goes all the way back to this era. So I guess I do have some things to add to this, I guess, that I didn't think about originally. Anyway, and then you had Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruling that separate but equal was okay. Obviously, this was overturned later on. And then, as you see, around 1829, the London Metropolitan Police Department was organized in London by Sir Robert Peel, and this was a much more formal police department, and they believed in the military structure that we still kind of have today when it comes to police departments, and relied a lot on foot patrol and the belief that these patrols would deter crime. Obviously, during this time, you didn't have cars and stuff, so I guess you could have horse patrol if you wanted to. But this model served as kind of the baseline that police forces, once they were created, during the Reform era and other eras and made to be more professionalized were kind of based on this London Metropolitan Police Department model. Diversity in the police departments, we still don't have a lot of diversity. The first black police officer was hired in Selma, Alabama, not too far away, in 1867, and then women were also hired in the late 1800s. Women were called police matrons, they weren't called police officers, and I believe your textbook talks about how black police officers were referred to as patrolmen and stuff like that, so they still had to kind of label them in a different way for black officers and women. They weren't seen as, I guess, deserving of the same title as police officer, which is just fascinating to me. But you know, these things are interesting to look at and see how this just occurred, and you know, how terrible these things were. Anyway, and we've come a long way from there where we consider everybody to be police officers. We don't have a lot of women or black police officers in police departments, as we'll see. So the role of police in the political era was a little bit different than what we see nowadays. They didn't really have uniforms. Like I said, there was a lot of foot patrol. Given the era, there was very little communication and very little supervision. You think about it, you didn't really have the police radios where they could be in constant communication with everybody. At the same time, if you had a crime committed, you know, you couldn't pick up the phone and call 911 to have the police come and help you. At the same time, the police couldn't get on their radio and call for help when they had a problem as well. And so there's very much a lack of communication. Because of the lack of communication, you couldn't really supervise them very well. The politicians tend to keep them at least doing what they wanted. Bribery was pretty prevalent. And then they started to get the call boxes, which essentially the officers would go to the call box and they could call into the station, and they'd call in like every hour or something like that to check in and so forth. And if there'd been any crime reported or something, then they could find out about it and go investigate it. Or if they found out about something, they could call the main switchboard and let them know. So that was kind of the beginning of communications, other than just yelling down the street and stuff like that. The interesting thing about this, and it kind of becomes interesting later on, is that during the political era, policing was primarily focused on providing service to the citizens, not so much law enforcement. So they ran soup lines, they found people lodging and work and stuff like that, which is really a good thing, I think. So you see that when we get to the Reform era, we don't really have that as much, and it becomes much more professionalized. But then we try to bring that back later on with the community service era. But anyway, police officers rarely made arrests, and more than half of those were for public drunkenness. You know, there's a lot of logistical difficulties during this era with making arrests. It's not like you just threw people in the back of the police car and took them down to the jail. Remember, you had no cars. So doing that was much more big production. You had to get a wagon and put them in there. Or, I guess, I don't think you could throw a prisoner on the back of a horse and ride them down there. But anyway, so officers tended to rely on a lot more on curbside justice, which was essentially hitting people with their batons and stuff like that in order to kind of punish them for whatever they'd done. And a lot of things, you know, like I said, focused on public drunkenness and stuff like that, minor offenses. So criminal investigations during this era were relatively kind of unprofessional, I would say. You know, a lot of times what they did was they started to hire former criminals, you know, or prison guards to be detectives, because they had more knowledge of the criminal behavior than your run-of-the-mill police officer did. This led to some issues and some resentment there, because the detectives got paid more than the regular patrol officers did. And then, you know, you've probably heard of kind of, you know, if there was a crime committed, what they call the Dragnet. There was a TV show called Dragnet. It was actually before my time, but I think I saw some reruns of it. But essentially where they just kind of bring in the known criminals and interrogate them to see if they can get anyone to confess. They relied very heavily on the third degree, brutal interrogation methods to get people to confess, which we'll talk about later on in class. But essentially, if you beat someone for so long, they'll tell you that they're the tooth fairy just to get you to stop. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are. But anyway, moving along there to the next era of policing, and this started around the 1900s. It's known as the Reform Era, and a big part of the Reform Era was related to technology. Around the early 1900s, you started to get automobiles. You had radios, you had telephones, so not only could police be more mobile, but they could really help to, communicate more with both the station, with themselves, with the civilians, with everybody. And so this really helped not only with that, but also with professionalism, as they had more accountability, as the communication increased. They really tried with this era to kind of take the political control away from it, so that police could allegedly be, more objective and more efficient. Obviously, if you have cars and radios and stuff, you can kind of go to where the crime is more easily than if you're just walking around without any intel. Just looking at diversity, in the Reform Era. You have a little bit more representative diversity during this time, but still not equal, as we would say. You look at the Reform Era as, in the 1960s, you had a lot going on too. You had, the civil rights movement and all these other things that kind of contributed to kind of what we call social change, right? Different opinions saying that we should have more equality, separate but equal is not cool anymore, and that did kind of bleed into policing as well, as it should. And so, these are important things to take note of as well. In 1910, Alice Stebbins became the first female police officer in the U.S. Remember, we had a black police officer in Selma, Alabama in the 1800s, but we had a woman in 1910. So take that for what you will. And so there was kind of an equal opportunity movement for women in policing. Today we have, more police officers that are female than I think we ever have, but that's still a very small percentage. I believe, if I recall, it's about 15% as of last year, and so 85% of police officers are still men. There's been a big push for that, and partly the issue with that is they just don't get a lot of applications from women. It's not so much of discrimination. From what I hear, a lot of departments are kind of trying to actively recruit women because they want more female officers. It's not a career that appeals to a lot of people of that gender. And so that kind of applies, or, is one of the issues with that. So if you're a female and you're interested in going into policing or law enforcement, you should be able to get into that relatively easily if you don't, aren't disqualified for doing something that you weren't supposed to, or some other problems. Anyway, and as you see here, you can see that kind of this percentage has gone up. I think this is from your textbook. And so the percentage of women has gone up. This is up to 2005, and like I said, it's right about the same nowadays. It's about 85% men, 15% women. Looking at the 1960s, and I kind of alluded to the fact that there was a lot going on with the civil rights movement that kind of perpetuated some of these things. JFK, Robert Kennedy, MLK were all assassinated. You had the due process movement in the Supreme Court with the passage of Mapp versus Ohio and Miranda versus Arizona, which you've probably heard of Miranda before, and we'll talk about Miranda and Mapp in a later week when we get to criminal procedure. And you started to get research showing that motorized patrols, detectives, and fast responses weren't as effective as they once thought. One of the interesting things I always like to point out to students is that, as a criminal justice major, you probably already know this already, but if you don't, then you should. And that is the fact that the crime rate in the United States, both property and violent, has been on the decline since the early 1990s. So when you see stuff in the news and stuff like that, thinking about crime is going up, that's not necessarily the case. It's been going down for quite some time. So we don't really have a big crime problem in the country, so to speak. At least it's much better than it used to be. And so the community problem-solving era was kind of the next era in your textbook, and we'll talk more about that in Chapter 13, as we have a whole module on community problem-solving era. But this goes back to something that we kind of lost in the Reform era, where we kind of took the police officers and made them more disengaged with the community, from where they weren't really doing the soup kitchens and helping people find jobs and providing service. They were much more focused on law enforcement. And so with the community problem-solving era, we kind of take the police officer and try to get them more into this service role. And this was brought about a lot by the early 1990s and crime problems. And also this idea that kind of the police need the citizens to help them in order to be able to solve crime. And that gets at this kind of idea of co-production, that the police and the community really need to work together to prevent crime in order to be effective. And so one of the other things that came out around that time was broken windows theory. I always put broken windows theory in quotation marks because a lot of criminologists don't really consider it to be a theory. But this really relied a lot on order maintenance and reduction of disorder in crime. Kind of the theory was that if you reduce and you start enforcing all of these minor things, then that will reduce the larger, more serious crimes. That's been proven to be untrue on several occasions since then, and is actually not really compatible with community policing. Because in community policing, you're trying to build trust and things like that, and get the community to work with the police. Whereas in broken windows theory, you end up with more of a zero tolerance type of policing method, where you're kind of enforcing all of these minor things, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that, you know, if you come and write me a ticket for drinking a beer in my front yard one day, the next day, if you come and ask me for help with something, I might be less likely to want to help and cooperate with the police. And so that's one of the things we've kind of figured out after that, was that was poor timing and not the best idea anyway. And so one of the things that you end up with is kind of this ends over mains syndrome with problem and community-oriented policing, where you kind of get caught up so much in what you're doing and how to do it that you kind of lose sight of the end goal, right? The end goal is that we're trying to reduce crime. And that's, you know, a prolific problem with things outside of policing as well. You have to kind of keep in mind, okay, this is what we're working towards. And that, if you do that, it can kind of help you to be more flexible with how you're going to do stuff, because you're focused on that. And there might be a better way to achieve that goal if you keep that in mind. Anyway. So moving along with that, there's a little video on what community-oriented policing looks like that I usually show my students in class. And this is, I believe, in Houston. I think I've got it on D12 if you all want to look at it. And if not, I'll add it on there. But it looks at Houston and kind of how they're addressing homelessness in the area. Instead of arresting the homelessness, the officer that's kind of in charge of that, he actually rides around on a bicycle and tries to help people. And one of the things with problem-oriented policing is not so much making arrests, but trying to figure out a way to solve whatever problem you have, right? And community-oriented policing is kind of part of that as well, as we'll talk about later on in class. But if you've got a problem of homelessness, then arresting all the homeless people might not solve this problem, right? Because you're really just moving them to the jail, and then eventually they'll get out of jail and they'll still be homeless, right? And that's a problem with several other issues like drugs and stuff like that too. And so in order to address these problems, it really encourages people, police officers particularly, to kind of think outside of the box, to think about, well, we've got a homelessness problem, we've got a drug problem in the area or something like that. The former chief in Marietta had an article a few years ago in a newspaper. He was talking about the opioid problem, and he said, we're not going to arrest our way out of this problem. And I think that's very true for many things, that you can't really arrest your way out of a problem. Sure, if you've got a serial killer running around killing people, then you put him in jail, and he's incapacitated, right? So with some things that might work, with others not so much. So anyway, this is just a little figure from your book. It talks about, help you all to illustrate the different eras and kind of where we've gone from there. One thing that I often tell students is that, I'm not entirely in agreement with your textbook that we're still in the community problem-solving era. I think that around late 1990s, probably early 2000s, we went into more of a militarization era. And this was, I think, caused by a couple of different things that happened, one of which was what was called the North Hollywood Shootout, which is where a couple of bank robbers attempted to rob a bank. They had body armor on and some other things, and had high-powered rifles. And the LAPD at the time had shotguns, 12-gauge shotguns, and I think 9mm and 38 caliber weapons. And so they were essentially outgunned by the bank robbers, and they had to go and get an armored car from the bank, and then go to a sporting goods store and get some hunting rifles in order to be able to get the firepower and the armor that they needed to be able to stop these individuals. The other one was the Waco shootout with the ATF. There was another situation where the police were, the ATF was outgunned by David Koresh and all of his folks, and so that led to, I think, the only time in history where the federal law enforcement has kind of called for a ceasefire and retreated. Consequently, after that, since some federal agents had been injured and shot, the FBI came in shortly thereafter and kind of laid siege to the compound. The compound was set on fire. A lot of the people in the Branch Davidians, which was kind of the cult, didn't come out. They all died in the fire. So anyway, this led to, a lot of issues with the police saying, hey, we're outgunned, we need guns and stuff like that. And then the federal government started selling some of their used stuff to police departments. So that's how you ended up with police departments with APCs, which is armored personnel carriers. Some of them have Humvees and stuff like that. And you're seeing a lot of police departments now issue their patrol officers M4, or as some of you might call it, AR-15s, and they carry them in their patrol, vehicles and stuff like that. You see a lot more vests. I remember when I was young, very rarely saw police officers wearing bulletproof vests, and nowadays I don't think you really see them without bulletproof vests. Even the overt carriers that they don't even have it under their shirt. So a lot more militarization going on there, and we'll talk about more about that later on in class. And I like to provide the example that in 1965 you had Barney Fife. For any of you that ever used to watch Barney Fife and Mayberry, you had the Andy Griffith Show. And so that was way back then, and he only had one bullet in his shirt pocket that he was allowed to keep, and Andy wouldn't even let him keep it in his gun. And then, nowadays, this is kind of the image that we see of the police officer. So a lot's changed, right? We'll talk about that more as we go forward with the class and things like that. So anyway, that's about all I've got for the history of police. So be sure to read your textbook and all of that. And I wish you the best of luck with all of that. And don't forget to take your quiz and complete your discussion board. And I will talk to you next time.